In 1940, the sky over Europe belonged to the Luftwaffe. German pilots were hailed as the finest in the world, veterans of Spain, masters of precision and nerve. Their aircraft, the sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the formidable Focke-Wulf 190, had torn through Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Even the Royal Air Force had barely held them off in the summer of that year. The myth of German invincibility in the air was born from these victories, and it lingered for years after. But by 1943, the skies were beginning to tell a different story. Beneath the smoke and glare of the European war, a quiet revolution was taking place. One that would humiliate the Luftwaffe more thoroughly than any defeat on the ground. It was not a single battle that brought them down, but a convergence of science, training, and industrial strength that changed the balance of power above Europe forever. The turning point began with the Allied strategic bombing campaign. What started as a costly and uncertain effort in 1942 evolved into a massive, coordinated onslaught against Germany's heartland. The 8th Air Force, operating from bases in England, and the 15th Air Force from Italy, sent thousands of heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators deep into Reich territory. Each daylight raid was an open challenge to the Luftwaffe. Come and stop us. At first, they did. German fighter wings, the Jagdgeschwader, rose in disciplined formations, tearing into the bomber streams with deadly accuracy. Hundreds of Allied airmen were lost in single raids. For a time, the Luftwaffe still looked unstoppable. But behind the scenes, Allied planners were studying every loss, every route, and every engagement. They were learning faster than their enemy realized. By late 1943, the Allies began fielding new aircraft that changed everything. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang, with its long-range drop tanks and Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, meant that bombers were no longer alone deep over Germany. Now, American and British pilots could escort them all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe's greatest tactical advantage, the ability to strike unprotected bombers far from Allied bases, evaporated overnight. Equally devastating was the speed of Allied production. While Germany struggled to replace its dwindling pool of experienced pilots, the United States was training thousands more each month, supported by vast industrial power. For every aircraft the Luftwaffe lost, the Allies built 5 more. And every new Allied pilot entered combat with better equipment, radar-guided control, and a clear sense of purpose. By 1944, the once feared Luftwaffe was on the defensive. Its veteran aces, many of whom had survived since the Battle of Britain, were being replaced by undertrained recruits rushed through abbreviated courses. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons. Radar stations and airfields were bombed before takeoff. And in the air, the humiliation was personal. Allied pilots, often half the age of the German veterans they fought, hunted them across the sky with a confidence born of numbers, speed, and superior machines. The Luftwaffe, once the sharp spearhead of Hitler's conquest, had become a shattered relic. Its commanders knew the truth long before the regime admitted it. Germany had lost the war for the air, and with it, it lost the ability to defend its cities, its armies, and its pride. The Luftwaffe entered the war with superb tactical doctrine. Its pilots practiced flexible finger-4 formations, tight communication, and rapid climb-and-dive maneuvers that once outclassed every opponent. But as the war expanded, so did the demands of air combat. The Allies adapted faster. The British introduced radar-guided interception, while the Americans developed complex escort coordination, turning large bomber formations into precise, overlapping systems of firepower and defense. The P-51 Mustang symbolized this shift. It could match or exceed the speed of German fighters and fly nearly twice as far. Its presence over Germany shattered the Luftwaffe's strategic advantage. The long-range escort meant the Luftwaffe could no longer isolate and destroy unprotected bomber groups. Every engagement now risked meeting disciplined swarms of Allied fighters ready to strike first. Technology amplified the imbalance. Allied bombers carried advanced Norden bomb sights and radar navigation, while ground controllers used sophisticated plotting systems to vector squadrons to targets and threats. Meanwhile, Germany struggled under resource shortages and constant bombing of its aircraft factories. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's technological edge had not only vanished, it had reversed. The hunters had become the hunted. For the men in the cockpits, the shift was devastating. Luftwaffe pilots, who had once roamed freely over occupied Europe, found themselves cornered above their own homeland. The stress was constant, the odds overwhelming. The rotation system that allowed Allied pilots to rest after a set number of missions didn't exist in Germany. Luftwaffe airmen flew until they were killed, wounded, or captured. Few lasted long. Morale collapsed faster than aircraft production could recover it. Pilots returning from missions often landed to find their bases destroyed by Allied strafers. The skies that had once felt like a place of mastery now felt like a trap. For many, the humiliation was as much psychological as military. They could see Allied formations flying overhead day after day, unstoppable, unchallenged. To take off was to risk death. To stay grounded was to admit defeat. Allied flyers, meanwhile, gained an increasing sense of control. Their missions were still deadly, but they no longer feared the Luftwaffe as a dominant force. Instead, they pitied it, a once mighty enemy now reduced to desperate maneuvers and half-trained boys in obsolete planes. In war, few reversals are more complete than when the predator becomes prey. Within the Luftwaffe's high command, leadership failures deepened the crisis. Hermann Göring, once an ace pilot himself, had become detached and erratic. He assured Hitler that victory in the air was inevitable, even as reports showed catastrophic losses. When squadrons failed to intercept Allied bombers, Göring blamed his pilots for cowardice, an accusation that shattered trust within the ranks. By contrast, Allied Air Command was built on adaptability. Leaders like General Jimmy Doolittle, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, and General Karl Spaatz encouraged tactical flexibility and coordination across services. Doolittle's decision in early 1944 to give escort fighters free roam, allowing them to break formation and hunt the Luftwaffe directly, marked a key turning point. It destroyed the remaining German air defense structure in a matter of months. Poor German leadership decisions compounded technical weakness. The insistence on developing experimental wonder weapons like the Me-262 jet, instead of focusing on practical defensive strategy, delayed effective responses. By the time jets entered combat in numbers, fuel shortages and inexperienced pilots rendered their potential meaningless. Leadership had failed both the strategy and the men who carried it out. The Luftwaffe's downfall did not only expose a tactical failure, it revealed the moral exhaustion of the Nazi war machine. The German ideal of technological and racial superiority was shattered by the sight of Allied bombers flying unopposed over the Reich. Each raid was not just a military strike, but a symbol, proof that Nazi promises of invincibility had turned to ash. Strategically, the loss of air superiority sealed Germany's fate. Without control of the skies, German armor and infantry could no longer move safely. Rail lines, oil fields, and industrial centers were systematically destroyed. The Western Allies' eventual landings in France and the Soviet offensives in the East both relied on this dominance. The Luftwaffe's humiliation became the foundation of Allied success. Morally, it left an even deeper scar. Surviving pilots later recalled their despair not just at defeat, but at realizing they were defending a regime they no longer believed in. The air war had begun as a contest of skill and courage. It ended as an act of survival in service of a cause that had lost all legitimacy. By the opening months of 1944, the German Air Force stood at a crossroads. The Luftwaffe still fielded nearly 2,000 operational fighters across Western Europe, a formidable number on paper. But paper could not capture the exhaustion behind those figures. The veteran pilots who had carried the Reich's air war since 1939 were nearly gone. Many had been lost over the Eastern Front or in the defense of Germany's cities. Those who remained faced an enemy that had learned every lesson the hard way and come back stronger. When the Allied bomber streams began pushing deeper into German territory, to Frankfurt, Regensburg, and Leipzig, the Luftwaffe scrambled to respond. It threw its best units into the fight. Jagdgeschwader 26, 54, and 300. Wings filled with the most experienced survivors of years of combat. They met the vast armadas of the 8th Air Force head-on, sometimes facing hundreds of bombers at once. The cost was unbearable. In February 1944, during the air battles known as Big Week, 20-25 February, the Allies launched an unprecedented series of strikes on German aircraft factories, engine plants, and assembly lines. For 6 days, nearly every major Luftwaffe facility came under sustained attack. The raids were not only military missions, they were deliberate provocations designed to lure the Luftwaffe into combat and destroy it. The German command accepted the challenge. Hundreds of Bf-109s and Fw-190s took to the air, determined to protect their homeland. What followed was a relentless, almost continuous engagement over Central Europe. In sheer numbers, the Luftwaffe inflicted damage. Dozens of bombers were lost each day. But the Allies could absorb the losses. The Germans could not. By the end of the week, over 600 Luftwaffe aircraft had been destroyed, along with many of the pilots who flew them. The humiliation ran deeper than the losses themselves. Allied formations that had once been scattered and torn apart now held together, supported by waves of P-47 Thunderbolts and the newly operational P-51 Mustangs. The American fighter escorts, freed from rigid formation duty by Doolittle's new orders, swept ahead of the bombers and hunted German interceptors near their own bases. Luftwaffe pilots returning from combat often found Allied fighters waiting above their runways, strafing the very airfields they depended on. For the first time since 1939, the German Air Force could no longer dictate when or where to fight. The initiative, the essential freedom that had once defined Luftwaffe tactics, was gone. The psychological weight of this change was immense. Many young recruits were shot down on their first mission, often before ever sighting a bomber. Training hours dropped to less than half of what they had been at the start of the war. Aircraft were plentiful on production charts, but sat grounded for lack of fuel, instructors, or even replacement tires. Big Week did not end the Luftwaffe's war, but it broke its back. The Allied bomber offensive could now proceed with confidence. Factories in Leipzig, Schweinfurt, and Augsburg were left smoldering. Hitler's air marshals promised recovery, but privately they knew the truth. The Luftwaffe had been drawn into the open and beaten on its own ground. From that point forward, the air war was no longer a contest. It was a slow dismantling. The months following Big Week were catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. The Allied campaign had done more than destroy aircraft factories. It had annihilated Germany's ability to defend its own skies. Every industrial region, from the Ruhr to Saxony, now lay within reach of Allied bombers. Cities once thought untouchable. Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden were exposed to daylight attack. The myth of German invincibility, once rooted in the skill of its airmen, dissolved in the exhaust trails above a burning homeland. In March 1944, the American 8th Air Force struck Berlin itself. It was not only a military operation, it was a statement. For hours, hundreds of B-17s and B-24s thundered toward the capital, escorted by long-range Mustangs that fought their way through layers of desperate German resistance. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had, but the results were devastating. German formations were shattered before they reached effective range. Many aircraft never made it back to their bases. The raid cost the Allies heavily. 69 bombers were lost. But the psychological cost to Germany was far greater. For the first time, civilians and soldiers alike saw that their capital could be reached at will. Göring had once boasted that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. Now, they came in waves. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe's operational strength was collapsing. Continuous losses, combined with chronic fuel shortages, left squadrons grounded. Synthetic oil plants at Leuna, Pürlitz, and Berlin, vital to sustaining aviation fuel, were targeted relentlessly. Each successful bombing run meant fewer aircraft in the air and more stranded on the ground. Even the new generation of aircraft, the Me-262 jet fighter and the Me-163 rocket interceptor, could not alter the outcome. The jet was fast, revolutionary even, but it arrived too late. There was no fuel to train pilots properly, no secure airfields to launch from, and no coherent strategy for its deployment. The Luftwaffe's humiliation became visible in every combat report. By late 1944, entire bomber formations could fly to the heart of Germany without seeing a single interceptor. When fighters did appear, they were often young boys from the hastily formed Hitler Youth divisions, men with fewer than 20 flight hours sent into combat against seasoned Allied veterans. It was no longer a duel of equals, but a slaughter. Allied gun camera footage from the period shows German aircraft breaking apart under cannon fire, their pilots never maneuvering, never returning a shot. The situation worsened further in early 1945 with Operation Bodenplatte, Hitler's final gamble in the air. On New Year's Day, the Luftwaffe launched a massive surprise attack against Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands, hoping to destroy as many aircraft on the ground as possible. The plan was daring but desperate, and it failed catastrophically. Poor communication, inadequate navigation, and Allied anti-aircraft defenses turned the operation into a disaster. Over 300 German aircraft were destroyed in a single day, along with many of the Luftwaffe's most experienced remaining pilots. The losses were irreplaceable. After Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. By spring 1945, Allied pilots roamed the skies unopposed. The once proud German fighter command was reduced to scattered remnants, short on fuel, leadership, and hope. The humiliation was complete. The organization that had once symbolized Nazi power and speed, the force that had darkened Europe's skies in 1940, ended the war as a memory, unable even to protect its own capital from destruction. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, Allied investigators entered silent, abandoned airfields filled with wreckage, half-assembled aircraft, broken tools, and training manuals for recruits who never graduated. The Luftwaffe had not only been defeated, it had been erased. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the defeat of the Luftwaffe stood as one of the most complete and symbolic collapses of the Second World War. Once hailed as the most modern, disciplined, and technologically advanced air force in the world, it had been brought to ruin through a combination of Allied endurance, industrial power, and the adaptability of ordinary pilots. For Germany, the consequences were immediate and devastating. The loss of air superiority had sealed the Reich's fate months before its armies surrendered. Without the Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht could not maneuver, resupply, or retreat without exposure to constant attack. Bridges, railways, and armored divisions that had once advanced with impunity were now cut to pieces from above. By the time Allied troops crossed the Rhine in early 1945, German ground commanders were fighting blind, their movements tracked and targeted by aircraft at every turn. The strategic impact was equally profound. The destruction of the Luftwaffe gave the Allies absolute control of the European theater. It allowed for the massive logistical operations that supported the D-Day invasion, sustained the Allied drive across France, and crippled German industry behind the lines. When the Red Army surged westward from the east, the skies were already cleared of opposition. Every German tank, every convoy, every railway line existed under the shadow of Allied air power. In purely human terms, the cost was staggering. Between 1939 and 1945, the Luftwaffe lost more than 77,000 aircrew and nearly 70,000 aircraft, a loss rate unmatched by any other branch of the German armed forces. For every celebrated ace who survived, hundreds of young pilots perished in training crashes, under fire from Allied escorts, or in burning cockpits over their own cities. The average survival time for a new Luftwaffe pilot by 1944 was measured in weeks. Meanwhile, Allied airmen who had once faced near-certain death in daylight bombing raids returned home as veterans of a hard-fought victory. Many expressed little joy and triumph. The images of ruined German cities, Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, were a haunting reminder that dominance in the air had come at a terrible civilian cost. Even as they celebrated, some Allied commanders questioned whether the relentless bombing campaigns had gone too far, blurring the line between military necessity and destruction for its own sake. Politically, the Luftwaffe's defeat exposed the inner decay of Hitler's regime. The same arrogance that had once fueled its rise, the belief in technological superiority and invincible leadership, had become its undoing. Göring, once paraded as the hero of the First World War, retreated into denial and self-pity. His failure to protect German cities destroyed his reputation even among loyal Nazis. At Nuremberg, his confident boasts about air power sounded hollow beside the evidence of total ruin. For the Allies, the destruction of the Luftwaffe marked a new age of warfare. Air superiority was no longer a luxury. It was a precondition for victory. The lessons learned in Europe shaped every military strategy that followed, from Korea to the Gulf War. Control of the skies had become synonymous with control of the battlefield. In the rubble of 1945, Allied pilots walked through captured airfields filled with wrecked Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. What they saw was more than the debris of battle. It was the wreckage of an idea that terror, speed, and pride could replace adaptability, training, and endurance. The Luftwaffe had not simply been defeated by superior machines, but by a system that learned, innovated, and refused to break. The fall of the Luftwaffe remains one of the clearest lessons in the history of modern war. A reminder that no force, however brilliant or feared, is immune to exhaustion, adaptation, and time. In the early years of the conflict, the German Air Force had embodied everything the Nazi state wanted to project: speed, discipline, and technological mastery. It was a weapon built for swift, decisive victory. But wars of endurance are not won by speed alone. The Allies learned what the Luftwaffe never truly grasped: that strength in the air is not measured only by machines or individual heroism, but by systems, training, production, intelligence, logistics, and leadership that can sustain pressure for years. By 1944, the skies over Europe reflected this truth. The Luftwaffe still possessed courage and skill, but the structure behind it had collapsed. No nation, no ideology, could sustain a modern air war without depth, adaptation, and humility before the facts of reality. There was a deeper humiliation, too, one that went beyond the loss of aircraft or territory. The Luftwaffe's defeat symbolized the unmasking of Nazi pride. The regime that had promised to command the heavens instead watched its cities burn beneath the contrails of enemy bombers. The myth of German invincibility, which had terrified Europe in 1940, ended in silence and smoke in 1945 for the Allies. Victory in the air came at a terrible human cost, to their own pilots and to the civilians below. But it also shaped a new world. Air power would never again be secondary. The skies had become the ultimate high ground, and every nation understood that control above meant survival below. And so, the story of how Allied pilots embarrassed the Nazis was not a tale of arrogance or triumphalism. It was the slow, relentless triumph of adaptability over ideology, of endurance over pride. In that victory, hard, costly, and unglamorous, lay one of the defining truths of the Second World War: that even the mightiest weapon can be undone, not by fate, but by those who learn faster than their enemy ever could.